your participation. And Emily, do you have anything else before we get started?
No, it's great to see so many of you here today. I'm sorry about the disruption last time. And we had to skip a meeting. We're tentatively looking at October 28th as the makeup. So if you could hold that on your calendar at the same time, we will be confirming that we're able to use the government channel and everything at that time. But we would like to wrap up the work as directed by the end of October. At our last meeting, we heard from Dr. Karen Cox, an excellent presentation about the lost cause and its connection to Confederate monuments, and gave us a national context. And this morning, we're going to hear from Dr. Willie Griffin, who is staff historian at Levine Museum of the New South, a Charlotte native, UNC Chapel Hill PhD, to really ground us in what happened here in Charlotte. And with that, to give Willie maximum time, I will turn it over to him. He is going to talk about the links Charlotte had to slavery, to the Confederacy, and the drive to establish white supremacy in North Carolina after the Civil War, and also give us a list of street names that are connected with those periods in our history. And so that will be what we will focus on today. Next time, we will, Dr. Cox will tell us, give us an overview of what other cities have done, and then we will decide how we will actually go about conducting our work. But it's now my great pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Griffin.
Thank you, Emily. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's a rather long presentation. I hope that everyone, Tiffany, were you able to give everyone, does everyone have a list of the names, street names so far? Are we going to email that out afterwards, or? Okay. I think you're on mute, Emily.
Sorry. Yes. No, everyone does not have it. We were going to send it after today's presentation.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
1 second, I'm getting this. Okay. Can everyone see that? All right. Okay. So first of all, I have to say that, I always tell people whenever I do presentations on subjects that are outside of my discipline, I always tell them, this is not something that I'm trained in, but I have been exposed to this history, these kinds of histories since undergraduate. I was an African American Studies major and history major at Morehouse College, and an African American Studies history master's degree from Morgan State. So I spent a lot of time studying the context for slavery in the United States, the African diaspora. So there is some understanding, although my PhD is in 20th century U.S. history. And as a native Charlottean, I've always been interested in the history of this city and the county. So a lot of this information is something that I really had fun putting together. The images that I have on the first slide represent sort of the bygone eras of the state and region's history that in many ways are still with us. In the center, you see a William Pfeiffer house, or the William Pfeiffer home, that was once located on North Tryon or South Tryon Street, and where legend has it that the last Confederate cabinet meeting was held. The other is a souvenir badge, and this souvenir badge comes from the Democratic primary party, or the Democratic Party in Durham County. I often use this whenever I talk about white supremacy, because I believe there's this this popular belief that white supremacy is a figment of our imagination. We most often associate it with trucks and Confederate flags, but to see it actually in print as a badge that politicians wore at the turn of the century, I think really brings it home to let people understand that white supremacy was something that was well organized in the state and the country by well-to-do men. These were not poor people who were somehow misinformed. So this was a well-organized campaign, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. The other picture is an image of a sketching of enslaved Africans, enslaved people of African descent who worked in gold mines in North Carolina and Charlotte, in the Charlotte region. Most often we think about slavery in terms of cotton plantations and huge plantations, but I think this is what really makes Charlotte unique in terms of setting itself apart from the rest of the slave South. Enslaved people of African descent were used to mine gold in this region, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. People often ask me about the slides that I use. I've been using these slides, this sort of the design of the slide for probably 4 years now, and it represents spilled ink because it reminds my audiences that historians often rely on the written record to confirm and analyze how events have evolved. And history is something that you really cannot erase because of that. Hide or forget, because as long as the historical profession exists, historians will be here to dig it up. So it's important. It really behooves us to not try to escape or dodge this history anymore. And so I'm really happy to be making this presentation. So the key points of the presentation to help us better understand slavery's impact on the growth and economic development of the Charlotte region. It's to show how Charlotte offered support to and contributions to the Civil War, and really show how Charlotte's role, what role did it play in supporting the lost cause and promoting white supremacy. There's perhaps no one who has studied and written about the era of slavery in Mecklenburg County more than retired UNCC professor Dan Moran. He reminds us that despite the fact that much of the era has been erased, Mecklenburg County was an essential part of the Cotton Kingdom of the Old South. Although we don't really see ourselves in the same light as places like Mississippi or Charleston, Charlotte played a huge role. Some of the places and images that remain include on McCoy Road, a few hundred yards from where my son attended Trillium Springs Montessori School just last year, there exists a slave cemetery that was erected by children of the slave owner. An enormous marker you see in the upper left-hand corner. In the middle of a 24 square foot plot of otherwise unmarked graves, this is only one of about 24 known African-American slave burial grounds around Mecklenburg County. And if you read the engraving erected by Albert McCoy's children and his slaves, Uncle Jim and his wife Lizzie and Uncle Charles and family, and it really brings up this idea that hopefully we can talk about after the presentation, this idea of benevolence. So versus perspective, these were children who no doubt had some fond memories of the people that they had once enslaved. But as historians, I believe it's really our responsibility to try to bring to light that there are more than one perspective on the past, and it's our job to really try to synthesize and make sense of these perspectives and put them side by side. For so long, only one perspective had been passed down to the general public, and it's why we are at this point, I believe, that we are now. There's huge misunderstandings about how slavery has evolved and its importance and its impact on present-day society. A photograph in the upper right-hand corner is a photograph that was discovered in April of 2010. CBS News reports said that it was found during a moving sale in Charlotte, and it was accompanied by documents detailing the sale of one of these young boys. His name was John, and he was being sold for $1,150, which was not a small sum in 1854. But it captures this forgotten era of slavery in Charlotte, a time when Black enslaved children were valued because of the years of potential labor that they could provide. The slave collar in the bottom left-hand corner has the inscription of Levi M. Rankin, a dealer of fine mules and Negroes. And this dates back to 1853. And it reminds us that enslaved Africans were considered chattel. And so this is somewhat different from, we always hear when we have debates and discussions about slavery, that slavery existed in all across the world at various times. But the slave system institution that was started here or founded in the Americas was quite different from the slavery of older eras, where enslaved Africans were considered property, no higher or better than mules or cows. And so there have been slave trades all throughout Africa, the trans-Saharan slave trade, the East African slave trade, as well as the transatlantic slave trade. But most often there is no term in African language that signifies the presence of a slave or that they even had slavery. These were most often prisoners of war that every place on the globe and in this world had. And so I don't want to get into a huge, long discussion, but there's a difference between the forms of slavery that evolved in North America and in the Old World, as we sometimes like to call it. The slave plantation, the Stafford Plantation slave cabin is the other image, and it's the only known domicile in Mecklenburg County where slaves once lived, and I believe this is out on the Plaza Extension Road out near UNCC. The enslaved population, just as the African American population in freedom from freedom up until today, has consistently ranged from around 45 or 30 to 45% of the population. In 1850, 44% of people in Charlotte were enslaved, and local laws were passed to closely control the behavior of Blacks. Enslaved people were not allowed in the streets after 9:30 without written permission from their owners. They could not buy, sell, or sell alcohol or smoke pipes or cigars in public. I don't really know what that was all about, but this could not leave. They could not leave their plantations without passes or assemble without permission from their owners. The enslaved could not hold worship services and were forced to attend white churches. There was a town guard, which were early forerunners of police, who roamed the streets from 9 p.m. until dawn, and they had the authority to visit and inspect all homes occupied by free Blacks. And so there was severe punishment meted out if they caught any of the offenders. And these guards were most often held up in high esteem, celebrated if they ever caught an enslaved African violating any of these laws. In 1860, slaves composed of approximately 40% of the local population, 6,800 out of 17,000, making Mecklenburg County one of the highest in terms of numbers of bondspeople in the North Carolina Piedmont. So this is a timeline just to give some really important dates in Mecklenburg County evolution of slavery. The United States, despite outlawing the importation of slaves in 1808, witnessed a massive expansion of the institution of human bondage in the 75 years following the American Revolution. There were just under 700,000 enslaved people in the United States in 1790, and that number increased to just under 4 million by 1860. And this number was really increased primarily through a system that was designed to be self-reproducing, which included both breeding practices and, in many cases, rape, which is something was an essential part of slavery that we don't often like to talk about. And so one of the things that I found really important that I never knew was, and if you pay attention to the 1800 to 1810, Mecklenburg County leads all other state counties in the cotton gin taxes. When Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1794, I always wondered how was he able to get paid for his invention. So what I've been able to find out is that counties all across the South actually bought the patent, they bought the rights, purchased the rights to produce Eli Whitney's cotton gin, and they collected taxes from local residents who used the cotton gin, who have built the cotton gin, who own plantations, and they used this money to pay Eli Whitney. Now, as I said, slavery was an important part. Slavery was an important part of the gold mining industry. It's something that we don't often think about, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. In 1790, let me see. In 1790, there were. Sorry, let me go to the next slide. So the number of those enslaved in North Carolina increased. Just to give you some local or state context around this national number, in 1790 there were just under, or in 1790 there were just around 350,000 enslaved people of African descent. That was in 1860, and that was up from 100,000 in 1790. Percentage of the population that was enslaved varied from county to county. There were over 19 counties in 1860, where slave populations were greater than the free blacks or free whites. And most of these were out in the East, where you had large plantations that really focused on cotton and tobacco and other products. There were more black people enslaved in both Virginia and South Carolina, and in the east or the western part of North Carolina, these were counties where there were very few enslaved people. Mecklenburg County, according to the map you see here, the enslaved population consisted of around 38.3% of the population. So some of the most imposing plantation houses in all of North Carolina Piedmont are located in Mecklenburg County. Each is a testament to the fundamental importance of slavery to the region's antebellum way of life. Cedar Grove was one of the largest in the county. It was established by Hugh Torrance, who appears in the Mecklenburg County records by 1779. This is 15 years before the cotton gin is invented. He purchased over 667 acres in that year, and by 1790s was in the position to purchase over 500 more acres during the course of the decade. Records show that Torrance's estate owned a substantial amount of livestock, including over 60 cows, 12 horses, 46 sheep, and 150 hogs. In 1790, he also owned 33 enslaved people of African descent. And by the time of his death, Hugh and his son accumulated a substantial tract of land of over 1,400 acres. And by 1840, they enslaved over 100 persons of African descent. And so and this was a concentration of wealth that was really not common for the area. Granted, I said that Charlotte and the region was a part of the Cotton Kingdom, but many of the very large plantations that had over 100 persons enslaved were truly in the deep South or on the coast of South Carolina, places like that. So this was really an unusual plantation for the region, and probably perhaps the largest. These are some names that I have here of other prominent family owning slave owners. Davidson, the Patterson family, the Behringer family, the Caldwell family, the Johnston family, Alexander, Pfeiffer, Osborne, and Latta. Some of these names are recognizable because of their names sort of spot street names, whether they're neighborhoods. The Latta plantation is still in existence. Alexanders have always been a prominent name here. Johnston was one of the earlier plantations and was a former mayor of the city. Of course, Caldwell and Behringer, and we'll talk a little bit more about those names when we get to the streets. These are some of the other prominent plantations that were large slaveholders in Mecklenburg County. The White Oak Plantation was established by William Johnston, who was a veteran of the Civil War. He owned over 414 acres of land in 1792. In 1790, he enslaved. Hello? Okay. He owned owned two people in 1790. By the time that he passed in 1840, he passed the land over to his sons. Initially, it came into the hands of his daughter Melissa, who married Zebulon Morris, and Morris was from another prominent family that enslaved 30 persons of African descent in 1850. He brought with him over 12 enslaved people, but he was never really able to compete on a large scale with other cotton plantations in the county. Rosedale is probably one of the more recognizable plantation homes. If it is a tourist attraction that you can easily miss if you drive up North Tryon towards UNCC from uptown. It's right beside a police station by 36th Street. It was believed that few served as a tax collector in North Carolina for several years before facing financial difficulties over mishandling of taxes. It was on once what was a 911-acre tract of land and was sold in public auction in 1818. Samuel McCorkle and William Smith bought the land for just over $4,000 and in turn sold it to William Davidson. In 1833. And so the Davison family owned a number of plantations in the area. This was just one of the many that they owned. I believe a handful of plantations that they owned. In 1833, after owning it for just above 2 decades, Davidson gave the deed of what was then, I think he divided the land to 486 acres and gave the land to his son-in-law, Dr. David T. Caldwell. Caldwell, again, that's another influential name in the city that you'll see donning street signs. And it remained in the Davison Caldwell, this land, up until throughout the mid 1800s. And between that period, there were 20 to 30 enslaved people of African descent working on the Caldwell plantation. The Beaver Dam plantation is considered the seat of the prominent Davidson family. It was built around 1829 and acquired in 1808. It's one of the oldest remaining houses in Mecklenburg County that is associated with the Davison family. And it was one of the most prominent, as I said, one of the most prominent planter landholding families. The Davison family in 1830 enslaved 25 people. Davidson inhabited this house for over 18 years, and the property once covered more than a square mile. In 1836, Davison College was established on the property, and in Davison's will, he requested that the enslaved be sold as far as practical so that mothers and small children were kept together. He also requested that his three oldest slaves be provided for during the remainder of their lives. These are the kinds of actions that early historians often pointed to as proof that slaveholders were benevolent people. In 1844, Davison left and moved to Alabama and sold the property to Patterson, Joseph Patterson, who brought with him 25 of enslaved people. The other property on the bottom left, sorry, was owned by the William T. Alexander. He was a native of Mecklenburg County and bought 100 acres along what is Mallard Creek, around Mallard Creek area right now, Mallard Creek Road, from Samuel Caldwell, again, another prominent name. And he built the plantation somewhere between 1820 and 1830. In 1860, the plantation thrived from the labor of 33 enslaved people of African descent who produced wheat, corn, and cotton. So gold was first discovered in this region in 1799 on John Reed's farm in North Mecklenburg County. Over the next 25 years on the land surrounding Little Meadow Creek, there were small pits that had been dug for a distance of a fourth of a mile on both sides of the stream. In these early efforts, enslaved labor assisted in these small endeavors. Between 1820 and 1830, partnerships began to form to create a massive gold mining operations. Observers recall seeing enslaved labor working in placer deposits, and you see that along these lines, these were how they shipped the sediment from the mining up to the gold mining house. But along these places were called um, placer deposits. In the morning, those people who owned slaves would have those Africans filling quart jars full of gold. Slave owners required between 4 to 8 slaves to fill a quart jar with gold every day. At one time, observers noticed that there were over 3,000 slaves could be seen working the gravel deposits along a single stream, which is a large amount of enslaved people. We often think about seeing that kind of labor often in cotton fields, but to see them along the streams mining gold again lets us know that slave labor was really crucial to the development of Charlotte during this time. A place deposit mining, as place deposit mining dried up, mining operations turned to extracting gold from underground veins. And this method initially brought in foreigners who were skilled miners, but labor disputes emerged between various European mining groups, and miners then turned to enslaved labor. At Gold Hill, which was a mining company just on the outskirts of Mecklenburg County, we can learn that some companies hired between or employed between 25 to 50% of its labor was enslaved. They were used to haul and wash ore during this era of gold mining because really being able to harvest the gold from the veins of rock was considered dangerous, and it was also skilled labor. What you begin to see is that some slave owners during this period are resistant or hesitant to loan out their laborers to these gold mining operations. But some of the companies owning slaves included the Bissell Barker Company, who employed 59 slaves in 1830. The Charlotte Cap Mine used 38 slaves, 10 of whom were women. And there were an estimated 5,000 enslaved Africans engaged in mining in Mecklenburg County during the height of the gold rush in the 1830s and 1840s. 4 slaves could earn on average in a 2-week span between $140 to $163, which is a lot of money. Slaves represented a major financial investment on the part of their owners, so it was not surprising that their masters exerted great effort to capture runaways. In 1860, the average sales price for a healthy young enslaved African was equivalent to the price of an average house. Admittedly, the deflated Confederate dollars, slaves sold in Charlotte in August of 1864 were brought for the following prices. A boy around 18 years of old was sold for $5,000. A boy who was 11 years old was sold for $4,000. A young girl who was 16 was sold for $4,000, and so forth. But runaway ads were placed in newspapers by slave owners were abundant. If you go to the website of University of North Carolina at Greensboro, they've digitized at least 162 of these slave runaway ads, and they range in date from 1790 all the way through 1865. And so these advertisers were seeking assistance in capturing escaped, so-called enslaved labor. And so this was also contributed to the rise of what I talked about earlier in the presentation, these citizens who would fill in the roles of police officers moving forward as society evolved. They saw huge rewards for getting involved in returning enslaved labor. And this really led to these ideas about white supremacy, which I really want to talk about spending time, that this idea of white supremacy really began to emerge during the institution of slavery. People like Thomas Jefferson was largely responsible for arguments that a lot of defenders and pro-slavery thought how it evolved in this country. Jefferson, in Notes of the States of Virginia, used arguments based on history, science, political theory, and practical necessity to justify race, and race to justify the continued enslavement of Africans. There were numerous defenders of slavery who elaborated on Jefferson's arguments that Jefferson's set out. One of those people was Dr. Samuel A. Cartwright. And this idea, I mean, I really found this was just almost unbelievable when I taught my students at UNC this idea of enslaved Africans being infected with a disease called drapetomania that caused them to run away, as if enslaved Africans enjoyed being enslaved, and those people who sought to escape, that they were somehow, something was wrong with them. And so there were people all across the South, like Dr. Cartwright, who came up with these ideas that to explain why enslaved labor acted the way that they did. He had described some enslaved laborers as lazy, prone to sleep a lot on the job. So that was reason that you had to whip them in shape and force them to work harder. But these were the kinds of ideas that began to thrive under the system of slavery. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of those ideas that Jefferson shaped in Notes of Virginia. He argued that blacks were inherently inferior to whites in their mental abilities and their moral virtues. He claimed that he had never found a black who had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never seen an elementary trait of paint or sculpture, no poetry. He just conveniently forgot about those people of his age, like Phyllis Wheatley, Lucy Terry, and even Benjamin Banneker, who actually replied to Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia with and talked about all the things that he had been able to do as a free black man in this country. Jefferson conceded that blacks were brave, but this may perhaps proceed from want of forethought, which prevents them from seeing danger till it is present. He speculated that blackness might come from the color of their blood, or that black women might have bred with orangutans. He asserted, without offering proof, that black men preferred white women as their sexual partners, which really became a huge political tool as we see the turn of the 20th century with white supremacy, and is still present today among some people who are racist. Their sexuality, like everything else, Jefferson described that blacks were less human and more animalistic. He believed that they were unequal. Blacks could never, in Jefferson's mind, survive competition with whites. He argued for the removal of Africans if they were ever freed. And he asserted that there would be deep-rooted prejudices entertained by whites. 10,000 recollections, he quoted, by blacks and the injuries they have sustained and new provocations, the real distinction which nature has made would lead to, quote, the extermination of one or the other race. And so these ideas of a race war were already being conjured up even before the end of slavery. He also feared that if free blacks stayed in the United States, that they might intermarry with whites. And so Southerners used theology, history, again, political theory, law, science, and economics to defend the central institution for the society. The largest single body of pro-slavery literature is based on religious defenses. Perhaps if you all are familiar with the Bible, Noah's son Ham and his grandson Canaan, the curse of Canaan, or Cain and Abel, in which Cain was cursed with killing Abel, or even with the story of the Adam and Eve story, where instead of the serpent offering an apple to Eve, there was a Negro gardener that was credited to Dr. Cartwright himself. This was the serpent story in Genesis. So oftentimes, whenever I talk about Jim Crow, we think about Jim Crow as only being segregation laws, and particularly in the popular imagination, we think about these laws. But I have to remind people that Jim Crow was an actual figure. Thomas Dartmouth Rice, or Thomas Daddy Rice, was born in 1808 and lived until 1860. He was an American performer who used African American vernacular to capitalize off of America's growing need to cultivate these racial differences. Rice became probably the most popular minstrel blackface entertainer of this period is probably and definitely the most wealthiest. Um, Indeed, he was considered the father of American minstrelsy. He made it popular both nationally and internationally to denigrate Black life in his first minstrel, Jump Jim Crow. And so the legend has it is that he was in Cincinnati, and where this was a free state at the time, or a place in the North that was free. And while walking through the streets of Cincinnati, he witnessed some African Americans dancing and singing, and he began to imitate them and came up with this play, the original, or the Jump Jim Crow figure. He reached his peak of popularity in 1832, between 1832 and 1844. And some of the things that were going on, just to provide you some historical context, is that New York abolished slavery in 1827. So there was this social need to control and challenge the image of African Americans as intelligent and equal citizens. Coal rose, you see this piece of sheet music, which would become a lot more popular in the 1870s. The image of was really responsible for creating this negative image of Black women, which helped maintain the destructive practice of exploiting their reproductive bodies for labor, particularly in the South, where slavery has still existed. The song portrayed Black women as unattractive, overweight, and overdressed, reassuring white women that white men could never truly love Black women in spite them constantly using their bodies to reproduce labor. Um, so George Washington Dixon was from Richmond, Virginia, and he introduced audiences to Cold Black Rose and another popular image, Zip Coon. A Black person, a coon was, or a zip coon was there were all kinds of coons, zip coons, but zip coons are one of the most popular. A zip coon was a Black person who was trying their best to please white people, or a Black person who was acting performatively or foolishly in a way that reinforces Black stereotypes. So these ideas, I really thought this was important. These ideas are really important to show that they were thriving even under the institution of slavery, and they only began to spread after the Civil War. So I want to talk a little bit more about Charlotte and its place in the Civil War. On the eve of the outbreak of the Civil War, leaders in Charlotte looked to folks like William R. Myers and Daniel H. Hill. Charles Lee and John Brown was another person. These are two other people who I could not find much information about. But the city leaders looked to their guidance in the course of action for the city. Sectionalism had come to a head with the election of Abraham Lincoln, and each man had gave political speeches supporting secession only if Southern states followed. North Carolina was the last of the Southern states to secede, but it's often brought up that North Carolina provided more troops to the Civil War than any other Southern state and lost more lives than any other Southern state. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Myers was an organizer of a vigilance committee that assembled to protect the community from incendiary fires. Although he was a wealthy businessman, he volunteered military service and supplied necessary equipment for the 34th North Carolina Infantry. He was commissioned as a captain for the company in 1861 and remained in the Confederate Army up until April of 1862 when the regiment reorganized. But this was likely due to a lack of military experience. He was not reelected. But nevertheless, according to widespread customs, once you are given a title like colonel, he was able to be called that and remain and keep that title for the rest of his life. Hill was more prominent in the Civil War and the Confederacy than Myers was. Myers, of course, is connected to Myers Park and a lot of Myers Street downtown, where there was a Myers Street graded school. He donated a lot of land he also donated the land of what became the Johnson C. Smith University. But Daniel Hill was a West Point graduate who was a Confederate general in the Civil War. He led soldiers into battle in Tennessee and was the founder of the North Carolina Military Institute. although there were no major battles in or around Charlotte, the city would play a significant role in the Civil War. Daniel Hill established this school in 1858, and the school furnished, as I said, many soldiers and officers to the Confederate cause. The school was located where the Dowd YMCA is currently located, and there was once a marker there, but I believe it has been moved, paying tribute to what was once the North Carolina Military Institute. At the start of the war, the branch of the United States Mint, which was founded in Charlotte in 1835, and this was something new that I had not known before I started doing this research, it was seized by a local battalion known as the Charlotte Greys. Then North Carolina Governor John W. Ellis offered the services of the Mint to print or to mint Confederate money for President Jefferson Davis, and it began printing money for the Confederacy. In May of 1862, because of this, the city was important rail center that connected coastal towns to the Piedmont. The Confederacy established a Navy Yard in Charlotte. The Navy Yard manufactured propellers, shafts, anchors, and other parts for ship boilers and engines. And so the story goes is that the Norfolk Yard was, to prevent it from being captured, the Union forces initially sought to destroy it, but the Confederacy was able to scare away the Union forces, and they eventually destroyed the Naval Yard and moved it to Charlotte in 1862. Again, this was the William Pfeiffer house that I had at the beginning of the slide. This is a picture of William Pfeiffer. The last meeting of the Confederate cabinet marker was erected. There's a marker there. I'm not sure if it's still there, but it was located at 722 North Tryon. It became the headquarters for General Beauregard in 1865. Pfeiffer had come to Charlotte in 1852. He was one of the wealthiest planters and slave owners. He had come from Catawba, and he had inherited land, money, and enslaved people. He was one of the two largest slave owners in the city, owning 28 slaves. The other was James Osborne, who was a state judge and at one time been the manager of the Mint Museum, or the Mint itself. He owned 23 slaves. According to Mary Kratt, Pfeiffer predicted a great future for Charlotte. There's a Pfeiffer Avenue located in Uptown, likely named for him, and connects North Tryon to North College Street between 9th and East 11th Street. This is next to the Hal Marshall Center. So I want to talk a little bit about the Confederate survivors and their lost cause, because I think it's really important to understand how belief in this idea of states' rights and the lost cause really took hold in the South. It's true that most of the Confederate soldiers did not own enslaved Africans or did not enslave Africans, but it's really important to understand the destruction of the Civil War, to understand sort of their psychological mind state after the war. There were over 258,000 Confederate deaths. And so when you think about that, there were more women who were widowed. There were more children who were orphaned as a result of the war. And the war touched more lives and communities more deeply than we had thought. And so it has shaped the course of ensuing decades of American history in ways that we just truly haven't really grasped. And so many of those people who did return, those former Confederate soldiers, they returned maimed, often missing limbs. This really was responsible for creating the prosthetic industry in this country. And so coming to grips with the fact that they had been a part of a war that was a failure, it's easy to understand why they would have latched on to this idea of the lost cause that was being disseminated, as Dr. Cox talked a little bit about several weeks ago. So these are just some of the other images. And so, I mean, thinking about those ideas about African Americans or Africans, formerly enslaved Africans, being inferior, again, you can understand why they would be quick to believe in this idea of a lost cause and that Africans did not deserve equality. They certainly did not deserve to vote or be placed on an equal playing field as they were. Some events that sort of could help us understand was an event that I found out about earlier this year. It was Lee Dunlap was an African American who had shot and killed James A. Gleason, who was a former Confederate soldier in Charlotte, over an insult in 1868. His lawyers demanded a retrial, arguing that there was no way that he could get a fair trial at the hands of an all-white jury. His case was successfully removed to other jurisdictions in North Carolina on several occasions. And intermittently between court appearances, whites routinely gathered around the jail where to lynch Dunlap, where he was being held, while blacks gathered to protect him. Over the course of 6 years, the case eventually made it all the way to the Supreme Court and raised the issue of whether African Americans should have access to equal due process in the court system. Unfortunately, the case was never decided on the eve of it appearing before the Supreme Court. Dunlap was allowed to escape. But this is a really interesting story because it points to this idea of not only whether or not African Americans should have equal due process in the court system, but what a lot of people don't know is that in the aftermath of the Civil War, Charlotte employed, I think, a couple, maybe 2 to 3 black police officers. And the person actually responsible for killing Gleason was a police officer by the name of John T. Shink, who was a prominent politician, black politician in the city. When Lee Dunlap and Gleason and the other white gentleman who had accosted the police officer were brought before the mayor in the courtroom, Lee Dunlap was there to testify that this white man who had remained unnamed, I could not find a name for him. Both Dunlap and Gleason appeared in court to testify. Lee Dunlap on behalf of the officer, John T. Shink, because black police officers were not allowed to arrest white suspects in 1867, 1868. And so Lee Dunlap came to defend Shink, saying that he was just doing his job. He in no way violated the man's rights. And Gleason, on the other hand, he found it appalling that a black police officer, that there were, first of all, black police officers, and that he would have the audacity to arrest a white man. And so during the proceedings, Gleason insulted Dunlap, I believe called him a son of a bitch, which in those terms were fighting words. And Lee Dunlap pulled out his pistol, because just about everyone carried at that time, and he shot Gleason. And Gleason, in an effort to retreat the courthouse, he was tried to flee the courthouse, and at the time, John T. Shink tried to prevent him from doing that and hit him over the head with a billy club, and that killed him instantaneously. And this sent an uproar across the city. And shortly after this, there were no more black police officers in the city because of this incident up until 1940. And so there are this was covered in dozens of newspapers across North Carolina, as well as, this should be New York Times. I see the New Times, but it was reported as far away as New York. So I want to talk a little bit now about the evolution of popular culture. I mentioned the fact, I talked a little bit about Jim Crow and Thomas Daddy Rice. By the 1870s, the emergence of sheet music had really taken a hold. This, again, was the first form of popular culture in America. And oftentimes, when people entertain, you would go into their homes, into their parlors. They'd have those pianos that played music, sheet music, and on their dining room tables, you would often find sheet music that had images of African Americans, and they were most often described in the sheet music, or the images went a long way to describe or portray African Americans in a certain light. And you can just read some of the titles to the sheet music. The Coon That Had the Razor, which portrayed African Americans, often portrayed African Americans as violent, ready to fight, always in possession of some sort of weapon. This idea of the zip coon you see in the 1896, all coons look alike, or all black folk look alike. This is something that is probably still believed in many circles today. Um, in the bottom left-hand corner, you see an awful, wicked N-word. The black man in the image is apparently with his partner, and he has one eye centered on the white woman in the picture of the sheet music, and he has just assaulted another black man who is lying on the ground now. And so this feeds into this idea that the earlier forms of minstrelsy set forth. That, remember, coal black rose, that black women were unattractive. This is how they portrayed her. Thomas Jefferson's idea that all black men wanted white women. So this kind of popular culture was actually feeding into it. And then the other more explicit piece of sheet music called the Coon's Trademark. This idea that all black people, again, carried razors, they loved watermelons, and they were chicken thieves. And so this was really popular. This was the way ideas were spread down, popular opinions. This is how they got the popular opinion to accept the treatment of African Americans. This was an incident that really shines light on the coming of the Wilmington Race Riot in 1898. In 1891, and what I found really interesting, that Henry Brabham was accused of murdering John Mocha. And what's really interesting about this is that this murder happened in the same place that the Lee Dunlap court case. So apparently, John Mocha was an Italian immigrant who had bought what was the former residence of the mayor. And by this time, I believe they had built a new mayor's office. And so John Mocha had bought this resident and had turned it into a store. But Brabham was described in stereotypical fashion by the media. He was called a gambler, and loved to drink and party and do all those kinds of things. And so once he was accused of killing John Mocha while he was closing down the business. He apparently hit him over the head with a tire iron. And so he was never really given his day in court. In terms of deciding, there was never really an investigation trying to decide whether Henry Brabham was the actual perpetrator. Once an African American was accused of committing a crime, most often that was it. That was sort of the final verdict. White mobs formed to lynch him once they placed him in jail, while blacks organized to protect him. And these groups clashed for two nights straight outside of the jail. And on one evening, as blacks gathered in a local church, the church was riddled with bullets. I'm not sure which church it was. I had tried to find, again, there are a number of articles that talk about this, that document this event, but none of them mention which black church it was. And so this was another event, and some of the articles talked about this idea that blacks were becoming more bold, particularly that they would gather and try to protect someone like Henry Brabham. Let them know that they believe that they could protect anyone, that nobody should be on trial or should be convicted of a crime. And so they believed that African Americans were showing too much bravado, and that they needed to take care of these African Americans. And they used the terms like Negro rule, which would become really prominent in the late 1890s. So I think this is really important. This provides some context to why the white supremacy campaigns of the 1890s really began to focus on the ability of African Americans to vote. And by the turn of the 20th century, you see the disenfranchisement efforts to prevent African Americans from voting. In 1890, there was a lodge bill passed by Henry, I think Cabot Lodge, out of Massachusetts, and it refers to a federal elections bill. And some critics called it the Large Force Bill. And so it was a bill that was proposed to ensure the security of elections for the U.S. representatives. The Confederate Democrats viewed the bill as a threat to their states' rights, especially after the Hayes-Tilden Compromise had really saw the withdrawal of federal Union troops in the South. And you can't read, you may not be able to read this headline, but this appeared on the same front page newspaper article in 1892. And this is the first instance that you begin to see this idea of white supremacy appear in the pages of Charlotte Observer. And they're talking about instituting this campaign of education to get people, opponents of white supremacy, people who did not support white supremacy, on the side of white supremacy, that they needed to be educated. And this was a political cartoon that portrayed African Americans coming to the ballot in force with weapons drawn, and really almost taking their rights to vote, and accosting white people in the process. And so these kinds of images, again, popular images that are used in the media, played a huge role in swaying public opinion and getting them on the right side of white supremacy. Now, often Charlotte has not been discussed in terms of the Wilmington race riots or support of white supremacy. In 1895, Henry Bryant, Red Buck Bryant, came back to Charlotte. He was a native of Mecklenburg County, and he began working for the Charlotte Observer, began volunteering initially unpaid. He was an unpaid volunteer. And in 1898, by 1898, he had established himself a reputation as a star journalist because of his coverage of Charles Aycock's campaign for governor. And he went out east. He was a traveling journalist who went out to the eastern North Carolina and began reporting on this campaign. And a lot of his articles were anti-Black. He wrote anti-fusion articles that were against the efforts of poor whites and Blacks that when they began to organize under the fusion ticket or the Populist Party. And this is what ultimately led to the need of Democrats, former Confederate Democrats, their desire to prevent Blacks and whites from unifying. And they came up with this white supremacy campaign as a way to disenfranchise and take Blacks out of power. And this actually led to the Wilmington race riots. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. Most of you know about the Wilmington race riots in 1898. But one of the most important elements of the race riots or the Wilmington uprising was the work that was done by Josephus Daniels in the News and Observer. He hired who was then probably one of the most important and popular political cartoonist named Norman Jennett. He brought him down from the New York Times, and he led the newspaper's campaign, creating all kinds of political cartoons. This was a really popular image called the incubus, and it portrays an African American really in a caricature type images, not very unsimilar from the sheet music that you see that I talked a little about a bit earlier, but it portrays African Americans as seeking to take control over or gain access to white women, white children, and controlling the ballot box. You see the ballot box chained to his leg. Shortly after the Wilmington race riots, what you begin to see take place in Charlotte is something that I call from extra legal lynching to legal lynchings. There were, just in a matter of months, there were 3 men who were publicly hung in Charlotte for apparently assaulting white women. So Joe Jackson was one of them. Julius Alexander was another. And so you begin to see Charlotte had always, you really begin to see this beginnings of Charlotte trying to portray itself as above the fray. There were no instances of extra legal lynchings or violence, save for the race riot that I talked about, the brief race riot that I talked about in 1891. And then by 1900, you begin to see the emergence of white supremacy clubs in Charlotte. Um, the first white supremacy club actually formed in 1896 in Belmont at a Woodman's Hall. But by 1900, these clubs had reached Charlotte in the aftermath of the white supremacy. And some of the prominent names that you may recognize, like Dowd, William Carey Dowd, was the founder of Charlotte News. W.F. Moody at the time was a lawyer and chief clerk in the state treasury. J.D. McCall, who was on the executive committee, was the mayor of Charlotte. Harriet Clarkson, the image that you see in the center, he was the campaign organizer, manager for Cameron Morrison, who was running for governor at the time, shortly after this. But I think what's most important about these white supremacy clubs is that it talks about the aim and object of these clubs was to maintain white supremacy, but also white labor in North Carolina. They wanted to make sure that only whites had access to good jobs, and these jobs at the time were primarily those jobs in the cotton mills. And so they did everything that they could to keep African Americans from being employed in cotton mills. And so this helps us understand how whites were given positions of influence and how they were able to build wealth so much faster than African Americans. It's because jobs were kept away from African Americans, and these white supremacy clubs, this is the way that they sold themselves to the average white person. And so the initial white supremacy club was started in March. By July, you begin to see these auxiliary white supremacy clubs being formed at local mills all across the city. This is at Victor Mills and the Gingham Mills. And you can see people were very bold. They put their names in the papers as being attached to these white supremacy clubs. I don't think any of them thought that, decades later, we would be exploring the history of this. But it really speaks volumes to the role that Charlotte played. This is an editorial that was produced around the same time on behalf of the white supremacy clubs. This was to the editor, asking all local mills and local businesses on election day as it approached in 1900 to let all white men off of work so that they could go vote. It was just imperative that they maintain their dominance at the ballot. I thought this was really important because in 1903, D.A. Tompkins wrote what became the first history book of Charlotte in Mecklenburg County. And a large part of the lost cause was controlling how we thought about the past and controlling the historical narrative. And if you read D.A. Tompkins' work, he is one of those people who writes very he's apologetic about slavery in many ways. He doesn't see slavery as being a bad institution. He portrayed most slave owners as benevolent and really spoke in disparaging terms about those people who were enslaved. And D.A. Tompkins is a really important figure in Charlotte. He's owner of the Charlotte Observer. He's, of course, the mastermind behind the construction of mill villages and cotton mills, as well as cotton oil mills all around the city. And in his manual in how to construct cotton mills, he often talks about the inability of blacks to work inside of a cotton mill because they were not as intelligent or didn't have the mental capacity to work the kind of machinery that you saw in cotton mills. And so I thought that him trying to gain control over the local history narrative is really important. It helps us understand how people never really thought highly of African Americans, particularly if they were not portrayed in positive lights in the history of the development of the city. This article, I think, is really important. This points back. I really wanted to show you how this sheet music, this form of popular culture, really influenced and how it worked in tandem with news media. Chicken Jim is killed. That's the headline. Jim McNeely, and I'll talk a little bit more about his brother, but Jim McNeely had been in and out of convict labor camps for, I think, a few years leading up to 1908. Convict labor in Mecklenburg County. Mecklenburg County was the first in North Carolina to use a permanent convict labor gang. And they used labor convicts from 1885 up until the 1940s to help build roads. And North Carolina was always known as the good road state in the South. And Governor Morrison, Cameron Morrison, was in fact called the Good Roads Governor. And he instituted this policy of use of convict laborers to help achieve these nice roads. And there are postcards that you can find online of images of these builders. Of course, they're not in the usual chain gang garbs of stripes. The postcards are made to look really pretty and portray this effort to build roads throughout the city and the state as a really an important endeavor that everyone should support. But it doesn't talk about the use of chain gang labor to do this. Jim McNeely was one of those people who had been in and out of these chain gangs, and how they describe him again, Chicken Jim, to insinuate that he was a known chicken thief around the city. So when he was shot, you read the headline "Chicken Jim Killed," you begin to think in the popular opinion, the popular imagination is this is something that he deserved. He was a known thief. And so we think about the way that media is used today to portray people or victims of gun violence and by police. I think there's some real similarities. I think that we can draw lines to or make some connections to. This is not something that is new. And again, the reason I think this is important because Jim McNeely was the brother of Joseph McNeely, who became the first documented lynching victim in Charlotte. And just to begin to understand Joseph McNeely's view of the police, because it's often talked about when we discussed the reasons why he was lynched. So apparently he shot a police officer who had been called to the scene out on South Tryon Street. Joe McNeely had been seen in the neighborhood waving a gun. And some of the people who called him said that he may have been on drugs at the time. And so when the police came riding his motorcycle to find out what was going on, as he came around the curve, Joe McNeely saw him, aimed his pistol, and shot the police officer. And ended up, the police officer did not die, but Joe McNeely was able to return fire. He shot Joe McNeely, and they were able to apprehend Joe McNeely. And because Joe McNeely was badly wounded, rather than take him to jail, they took him to the Good Samaritan Hospital and handcuffed him to the bed. And again, this is where you begin to see this idea that Charlotte is above the phrase in terms of how the media reported on it. One article said Queen Charlotte indeed, really hailing Charlotte for its being able to allow this man to get his day in court, that lynch mobs did not form. But again, a few days later, I believe it was just a period of maybe 4 to 5 days later, a mob did finally form, and they stormed Good Samaritan Hospital, dragged Joe McNeely from his bed, and riddled him with bullets. I believe the crowds were estimated between 40 to 60 masked white men stormed the hospital again and riddled him with bullets in front of Good Samaritan Hospital, which is now at the site of Bank of America Stadium. And so the media condemned this behavior, called those people hoodlums. But this was, again, so you begin to understand that the relationship between the African American community and the law enforcement had never really been on good footing. And so if Joe McNeely understood how law enforcement had really been in how it had the relationship that it had within his own family, his own brother was killed by law enforcement just a few years earlier, you can understand why he didn't have a positive view of law enforcement. This was a letter that I found from Alexander Graham, who was the school's first superintendent, and it shows how he supported the lost cause. In 1927, he wrote at least one speech for Roman Rogers. Roman Rogers was a prominent organizer. He traveled around the state and organized the Sons of Confederate Veterans chapters, and so he used this speech as a way to suggest that slavery was not the cause of the war between the states. And he goes through some old convoluted rationale that this was actually, the war was actually about trying to create political balance in terms of representation in House seats in the federal government. But I think it's really important that we understand this because Alexander Graham, these ideas of the lost cause were being spread by really prominent people in the city. Alexander Graham, I ran across Alexander Graham first in my own research. He walked into the classroom of Tresvant Anderson, who I'm writing a biography now, when Tresvant Anderson was just in second grade. And he lined all of the kids up, very similar to what the way that I portray it is as a slave auction. He looked at these young black kids in second grade and pointed to Tresvant Anderson and said that Tresvant Anderson was too small to be in second grade and to put him back in the first grade. And so he was, without testing him, without seeing whether he had the intellect to do second grade work, he looked at him just physically and said, put him back in the first grade. And this affected Tresvant Anderson in numerous ways, really forced him into a life of activism. But these kinds of ideas, Alexander Graham himself came from a slave owning family around Fayetteville. These are ideas that were accepted and being disseminated by really prominent people in the city. The 1929 Confederate reunion, the way the Charlotte Observer reported it is really eye-opening. They talked about Charlotte as being a beacon of light in the former Confederacy in many ways. It was proof that the South had, quote unquote, risen again. The reunion had really took over the city from June 4th through the 7th. There were thousands of people coming into the city by train. People volunteered their cars to go to the trains and pick former Confederate officers and soldiers up. They used the former, I believe at the time it was the World War I base out, and I'm forgetting the name of the place out in West Charlotte, but they set up tents for these people, these former Confederates, to house them, and it was like a huge celebration. I mean, they came into the city, and the way that the Charlotte Observer portrayed this, they talked about Charlotte being an example of the South rising, and talked about its textile industry. They talked about the nice buildings. They talked about the importance of factories. They talked about it being the last cabinet meeting, being the place of the last cabinet meeting. And they talked about all of the money, the economic center, the banking industry, the emerging insurance industry here in Charlotte. And so the city was really celebrated as a place that Confederates should look to as a sign that they had actually won the war in many ways. And at this reunion, this is where you have one of what I believe is probably one of the more explicit Confederate monuments. And just to pay attention to the last sentence, that accepting the arbitrament of war, they preserved the Anglo-Saxon civilization in the South and became master builders of a reunited country. And so this points to Charlotte's sort of centrality in the Confederacy's view of the Civil War and why Charlotte was such a prominent place for them. And I think that is, so again, this was the last slide. And I thought it was really important to show these lynchings in context because this was the second documented lynching, and it happened just weeks after, a few weeks after the reunion. This particular lynching was of Willie McDaniel out in the Newell section of Charlotte, not far from the CPCC center, or the center out near UNCC. And Willie McDaniel was a sharecropper who had just come to Charlotte in the I believe 1928, and had secured a job on Melvin Greer's farm out near Greer's Road. And apparently there was a dispute about payment, and he got into an argument with Melvin Greer, and Melvin Greer went into his, again, having the audacity to get into an argument with Greer, a white man. He went into his home to retrieve a rifle at the time to shoot Willie McDaniel, and Willie McDaniel was able to run before Greer came back out of the house. But later that evening, Greer's Willie McDaniel's body was found hanging. It had been hung from a tree, but it was drugged to the adjoining property to try to conceal the actual hanging. And so this became the second documented lynching in Charlotte. And it appears as though there was some kind of cover-up by the county law enforcement at the time. But I thought that this was really important to help really try to provide some context of how ideas of white supremacy have played out on the ground. And so I think that's it. So I'll take any questions you have about the presentation.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Griffin, for that extraordinary presentation. There is so much to take in. Thank you. Thank you. It certainly grounds this work that we're about to undertake. Tiffany, how do you want to handle questions? I think that's really what we should spend most of our time on here that we have remaining today. Willie, do you have the street names that you can put up? Not now, but maybe in a few minutes. I think right now we really want to take questions.
Okay.
Tiffany, how do we want to people?
Sure. If people want to either raise their hand in the actual WebEx, there's a little hand sign. They can raise their hand, or if they just want to raise their physical hands, I can see everyone. Whichever way people prefer, and I will call out names as I see them.
Questions, responses.
You can also post things in the chat if you'd like to type your question into the chat. You can do that as well. I see Alan's hand.
Dr. Griffin, how different was Charlotte than other southern cities like Raleigh, or at least North Carolina cities, or clearly Wilmington there were challenges there, or was Charlotte really a leader in the kinds of activities that and promoting white supremacy that you outlined?
Yeah, I believe that Charlotte was probably similar to places like Raleigh. I think that the News and Observer worked closely with the Charlotte Observer because newspapers, again, played a huge part. They were leaders in disseminating these ideas of white supremacy. So Charlotte and Raleigh really worked hand in hand, as well as places like Durham, where you had an elite infrastructure with the mills that were popping up around Durham. And I forget the guy's name who was present at the erection of Silent Sam on UNC Chapel Hill. He was a leader in Durham. So, and at the beginning of the initial the presentation, I showed you the white supremacy badge coming out of the Durham Democratic Party.
And just one follow-up, how did the more rural parts of the state, how did this manifest itself? Was it just a continuation of what were the historic relationships between whites and blacks in more rural parts of the states?
Yeah, I think it really depended on the sort of racial makeup of those rural parts of the state. Like out east, what they called historically out east, there were larger black populations um, where blacks still remain some semblance of, I guess, control over their counties. They were not allowed to vote, but because of their sheer numbers, they were able to sort of turn inward and have so these insulated communities where they may not have been politically active. But in the other rural parts where whites dominated in terms of population, they most often lived in fear because you had the prevalence of more Ku Klux Klan or red shirt chapters that were much more bolder in their sort of outward politics.
I also saw Beatrice Thompson's hand.
Yes, Tiffany. First, let me say, Dr. Griffin, bravo. You have truly taught this native daughter even more and substantiated some things that I'd heard in stories growing up. So I thank you for putting the historical context that we need to have and what we're about to do. Here's the thing I wanted to ask. When you talked about AG, Alexander Graham, who has AG Junior High School named after him and everything, and school superintendent, so many of the things that were overt, but they became more covert. Is there a timeline as to when we saw these things becoming more covert but still active? Because I would dare to say that the mindset is still active now, but the outward expression of it, whether in newspapers or in stories or in actions such as lynchings, is there a timeline that you can see when these things became more covert, continued?
Well, I mean, I try to point to the sort of the covert nature of dealing with what quote unquote criminal behavior of African Americans, and that was sort of immediate. Whenever there was a lynching, again, there were only 2 documented lynchings, but I imagine that there probably were more in the rural parts of North Carolina or rural parts of the county. There was at least another one that was described as a lynching in 1908, but because it was not documented, but it seems that there were more covert efforts to deal in terms of how law enforcement dealt with African Americans. But I think that the most important part that where there hasn't been a lot of research, and I'm ecstatic that a Harvard professor now is writing a book about how white supremacy was taught inside the schools in the curriculum. And so that's something that I have not been able to really get a grasp on or get a grip on how children were taught in the schools in Charlotte, Mecklenburg from the turn of the 20th century onward. I do know that by the late 1940s, the NAACP under the helm of Kelly Alexander had brought in a professor a renowned professor named Martin D. Jenkins that began to raise this issue of how African Americans were being taught, and you know the kinds of things that they were being taught were totally different from what whites were being taught, and them having access to the latest classes in terms of sciences and literature and all those and math. Those things were being denied to African Americans. Which helps us understand this idea of the achievement gap. You know, these things have been sort of embedded into the curriculum for a very long time. So I haven't done any real work to try to understand that, or I haven't made any ground in trying to understand that.
Thank you.
Okay, I have Lynn, and then I have Dr. Cox.
Yeah, and Dr. Griffin, thank you very much for that presentation. It's incredible amount of work you did on it. It's very good. It's kind of a comment, and then I guess a question or an observation. You know, you've kind of shown that there was a big lost cause component here, and I guess something that kind of surprises me is that Charlotte didn't have more statues to what were known as Confederate heroes. We have that one monument to the Confederate dead in the cemetery, not exactly a place of prominence. So many other places you go, I mean, Jefferson Davis came through here. You would have thought
Right.
somebody would have put a statue up, and I
Right.
can't exactly figure it out. I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I've thought about that often, but I guess the conclusion that I have come to is that Charlotte has always been a place that has been on the move and has always talked about growth and rebuilding and always really concerned with recreating its image. So buildings have been torn down. Really nice. So I mean, I really attribute it to that, just the idea that Charlotte has often been engaged in this effort to rebuild and reframe its image. And in the process, they have never really been a place that embraced the old South, that always portrayed itself as the New South. There were a few places around the South, like Atlanta, Charlotte, Louisville, that portrayed itself as these quintessential New South cities. And so in being a New South city, you always want to be the shiny city that has large skyscrapers. And when you're doing that, real estate becomes really valuable. And so you don't have time to allow a piece of real estate, particularly in the center of the city, to remain the way that it is, or in its sort of a historic state, because some real estate investor or an agent is always thinking about the possibilities for this land.
Okay.
Dr. Cox?
Hi, everybody. I wanted to thank Willie for his presentation, but I also want to amplify some things that he said and then add a few things, if that's okay. I think what I'm taken by is the presence of the lost cause in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it just shows us that, like, rather than being the sort of the bright and shiny new South City that we often think about, that there was definitely the underlying themes of the lost cause in the growth of Charlotte in the late 19th and early 20th century. I want to also speak to B. Thompson's question about when do things are more covert. And I don't know if she's referencing the blatant white supremacy, or is this something different that you were referencing?
Karen, let me answer that. Not only the blatant, but the systemic that was not on the front page all the time, but these efforts were continuing, and for people of color to find out about it, and you go, well, why were they doing that? And Willie made reference to it in the educational aspect of it. For many of us who came through Charlotte Mecklenburg school system, the mere fact that by the time I got a book, there were already 12 names in it. And it wasn't a name from my community or any schools that I went to. So that was why my reference to Alexander Graham. You're in the educational system, and from the business standpoint, about the mills and the systemic way of keeping people of color out of there. So I guess what I'm saying, it went more covert to where the general public didn't see it out there in their faces, but it has been intertwined into life, and people who had power and the money were the ones with.
Okay, I do think that
that's what I was thinking in terms.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think there is this curricular part of all of this. One of the things that Willie mentioned is the thing about textbooks, and it is probably a good thing to remind everyone that, African American schools ended up getting the cast off textbooks from white schools. And so that kind of material would have been, in the books that Black students would receive, although the way in which that will be countered is through the teachers, the actual African American teachers in the school system, which is what in my discussions with Harvey Gantt, that was what the way he explained it to him, to me, because the lost cause was all around him in a place like Charleston, South Carolina. The other thing is that I think I don't know, that white supremacy is ever covert in some ways, right? That it's always there, and certainly African Americans recognize it. And I think one of the things about it is that it's just so common, it's just so accepted and understood that there's no, I mean, you know. And so what it is this backlash to racial progress. So when they feel like they've got it tamped down, you know, so this is why you have the rise of these white supremacy campaigns and the rise of, you know, this epidemic of lynching in the 19th and late 19th, early 20th century. Once they feel, you know, whites feel like they've got that tamped down, then they, you know, things seem okay and there's ease there. And then you have, you know, another, a wave of racial progress or of efforts at racial progress through the civil rights movement. And then you see once again, whites rise up against to try to suppress that. And so, to me, that, like, you know, when does it really go covert? Honestly, and the way I think about like that is in the post voting rights period, and then, you know, and then finally, you know, what we've seen in the last 30 years is another wave, another rise of white supremacy, and that is coming at us since the 1990s, and it's done through various ways. What we might say is covert, it's not covert anymore. We know about gerrymandering and districts, and we know the ways in which African American voters are suppressed, and along you know, paralleling what's happening politically is also a rise of these white supremacist organizations and a push towards that by groups like the League of the South, which was formed in 1994. But then there's a whole, as if you were to go to the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, you would see an explosion of white supremacist organizations. Again, a lot of this is a backlash to the racial progress initially in 1990s, it's a backlash to racial progress since the Voting Rights Act. And so what it seems like it's covert, it's building slowly until now it's like it's all out in the open. Nobody, you know, there are no more hoods, people, you know, Klan hoods, you know, they're out in the open. And so, one other thing I just wanted to speak to about the lack of Confederate monuments in Charlotte, North Carolina. Because the group that put them up, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who put up the monuments all over the South, it could be as simple as that there was not an active UDC group here. It's not just about Charlotte necessarily, because there were a women's organization put the monument up. The Ladies Memorial Association did that to the one in the cemetery. So was there, you know, an active UDC group here in Charlotte or Mecklenburg County? Well, we know there are monuments in Mecklenburg County, right? We know there are some outside, but in Charlotte proper, it could have been as simple as that there was not a UDC chapter here that was pushing for that. And so I just want to put that out there. I don't know, because I'd have to do the research on the UDC specifically.
Thank you, Dr. Cox. Any final questions? Because since we have to finish at 12:45, we only have a few more minutes. Anyone else with a burning question? Tiffany, I'm assuming we're going to send out the PowerPoint presentation to everyone. Yes. So hopefully you'll have time to review it and think about it. There's so much to process. Again, thank you, Dr. Griffin. Do you want to put up the street names and just introduce the categories, or do you want simply to go ahead then? I would do that. And again, you will receive this and then really want everyone to think about the presentation as well as the street names and the categories that Dr. Griffin's going to review.
So, and I want to say, as we go through this, that I helping me do this, Tom Hanchett, Dr. Hanchett was really instrumental in discussing how these things should be separated. You know, Tom has done a lot of work in the city around neighborhoods, and so he's recognized a lot of the street names and helped me fill in some holes and gave me some different ways to thinking about this. But what I tried to do was organize. There were hundreds of street names, literally, and so what I tried to do was the categories that you'll see are streets that are named for leaders who actively fought against equality, just to give us some way to begin to think about these street names. There is a category for streets that were named for leaders who fought for or played a role in the Confederacy. Bragg Street, Moorhead Street. There are some street names that are categorized for people who owned enslaved Africans or enslaved Americans. And so these names may include some of the people like the founding fathers, like Benjamin Franklin. I added just a little caveat here beneath this one. Tom reminded me that there are some other founding fathers that streets are named after, like in McCrory Heights, you have Washington, Madison, Van Buren Street. There's also a Jefferson Drive near the Jewish Community Center. And so you'll find the street names and then some historical context behind those names. Like Caldwell Street, there are a number of streets named after Caldwell, but as you recall from my presentation, there are a number of prominent Caldwells who it will be almost impossible to determine which street was named after which person. There are street names as well. Cameron Street was a name that I think is really, it has to be pointed out that Cameron could be named after Cliff Cameron of the Cameron Brown Mortgage Company, which became later First Union. There's also Eddie Cameron, who was beloved throughout the state, which is named has Cameron Indoor Stadium adorns that name. But Cameron itself, the name was a really prominent slave-holding family in North Carolina, in both North Carolina and Virginia. They actually were the owners of the largest plantation in the state, Stagville, and they were in the business of slave trading all across the South. And so that's why I thought it was important to know that name. I don't know if we'll ever be able to find out which streets reference that family, or if they actually reference that family, but I think it's something that we have to consider as a group. So there are, let me see, one other category, streets that are named for places or people that have secondary ties to slavery. So there are, dozens of names that pay reference to, or, pay this sort of homage to that era: Antebellum Drive, Cotton Planter Lane, Dixie, there's Eli Whitney, and a number of plantations and planter lanes, as well as a Stone Mountain Court. So there are 8 pages of names. You can go through them. I give you some history behind, again, the history behind the people that they could possibly be named after. And it was a lot of research.
Thank you for that amazing amount of work. I mean, it is going to ground everything we do going forward. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Tiffany will be sending these 2 pieces out to you, the PowerPoint presentation and the list of names. And I really urge everyone to really review these carefully, because this is where we will resume when we meet again in 2 weeks. Tiffany, do you have anything else you want to add?
Sure, and I'll also include the link to this presentation that'll be on YouTube, so that if you do want to go back and watch parts of the presentation from today, you'll be able to do that. So I'll have all of that included in the same email in one packet. So that's all I have. And
Tiffany, when do you think that will be going out? When do you think that will be going out?
It is today, Wednesday. Let me check with the communications team about when I can get the link. They typically are pretty quick. They can turn it around in a day or so. Okay. So hopefully I can get that to you by the end of this week.
Okay, terrific.
And Tom has just provided a link in the chats for the Confederate monuments here in Charlotte. All the Confederate monuments. I don't know if that's all. He said there's a question mark about whether they are all. So Karen,
Tiffany, if you could send that out as well, The interesting thing that I've learned, and we will have an answer, a definitive answer by the time we reconvene, is actually we're not certain there are any Confederate monuments that are directly under the city's control that we need to consider beyond those that are at Elmwood Cemetery. But we're trying to get that clarified, that whole question of which ones are actually under the purview of the city and therefore ones that we need to consider. But we for sure need to concentrate on the street names. So that's really why I asked you to review this very carefully between now and our next meeting. Tiffany, anything else? I haven't been able to, I know that I've seen some chats coming up, but I haven't been able to read them. Let me see.
No, I copied those links. Sorry, I was copying while you were speaking to make sure I had them saved so I can send those out with the information. So yes, I'll send both those links out as well when I send out the packet of information.
Okay.
And communications has the link, so I will try to get this to everyone before the end of the week.
Very good. Thank you. It's 12:45. Thanks so much for everyone joining us today. Be well and see you next time.
All right.
Thank you. And I'll just note, Dr. Cox, I do see your note. Yes, next week, the next meeting in 2 weeks, you will speak to what other cities are doing on this effort as well. So that's super helpful. Thank you so much for that note.